Sometimes the hardest things to heal aren't broken bones, they're broken spirits that everyone else has given up on. For 3 counties, one wild donkey had become a living nightmare. It kicked, it bit, it charged at anyone who came close. Ranchers walked away, wranglers got hurt trying. Even the vet recommended putting it down. Then came Hank McCallister, 76 years old with a bad leg and a gentle voice, who believed that no creature turns mean without a reason. What happened next defied everything the town thought they knew about stubborn animals and patient men. Could one old cowboy, with nothing but time and understanding, do what force and fear never could? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ridgeline. Montana wasn't much more than a collection of weathered buildings scattered along Highway 89, the kind of place where 3 generations might share the same last name, and newcomers were still considered new after a decade. The town had one stoplight, a feed store that doubled as the informal community center, and a diner where the coffee was always fresh and the gossip fresher. Mountains rose in the distance like ancient sentinels, their peaks snow-capped even in summer, watching over the valley where cattle outnumbered people by a considerable margin. Hank McCallister had lived in Ridgeline for 54 years, ever since he'd married Martha Jennings and settled down after his rodeo days ended. His small ranch sat 3 miles outside town, a modest spread of 40 acres with a barn that leaned slightly to the left and a house that had known better days but still kept the rain out. The front porch sagged in the middle, worn down by decades of boots and weather, but Hank couldn't bring himself to fix it. Martha used to sit there every evening, watching the sun set behind the western ridge, and, somehow, the sag felt like her weight was still pressing into the wood. Each morning began the same way. Hank woke at 5:30, his body still operating on rancher's time, even though he'd scaled back his operation years ago. He'd make coffee in the old percolator Martha had insisted on keeping, despite his suggestions that a newer machine might be easier. The burbling sound it made as the coffee brewed was a small comfort, a familiar rhythm that marked the beginning of another day. He'd carry his mug to the porch, Chester padding along beside him, and they'd watch the valley wake up together. Chester was a blue heeler, 12 years old now, with a graying muzzle and eyes that still held their working dog intensity. He'd been Martha's dog originally, a birthday present Hank had brought home as a puppy, but when she passed 5 years ago, Chester had transferred his devotion to Hank with the quiet loyalty that defined his breed. The dog rarely barked, seemed to understand when Hank needed company and when he needed silence, and had a way of resting his chin on Hank's knee that felt like an anchor in rough waters. The house told the story of Hank's life in objects. In the living room, a glass-fronted cabinet held his rodeo buckles, each one representing a different victory from a different year. The largest was silver, ornately engraved, won at the national finals in 1972 when Hank was 23 and thought he was invincible. He'd ridden a horse named Tornado that day, an animal everyone said couldn't be ridden for the full 8 seconds. But Hank had stayed on, had felt the rhythm of the horse's fury and matched it with his own young strength. When the buzzer sounded and the crowd roared, he'd known that was the peak, that nothing in his life would ever quite match that moment of perfect triumph. The buckle sat in the cabinet now, tarnished in places despite Martha's insistence on polishing it every few months. After she died, Hank had stopped maintaining it with the same care. Sometimes he'd take it out, run his thumb over the engraving, remember not just the ride, but what came after, learning that staying on for 8 seconds was easier than staying present for a lifetime. The buckle had taught him something about patience, about reading an animal's fear and responding with calm instead of force. Not every cowboy learned that lesson. Hank had been lucky, or maybe just observant enough to notice that the angriest horses were usually the most frightened ones. Photographs covered the walls in mismatched frames. Hank and Martha on their wedding day, both of them impossibly young and grinning like they'd won the lottery. Martha, holding their daughter Emily the day she was born, tired and radiant in equal measure. Family gatherings, holiday dinners, snapshots of a life built one ordinary day at a time. Hank couldn't pass through the room without seeing Martha's face, and he'd stopped trying to avoid the ache that came with it. Grief, he'd learned, wasn't something you got over. You just learned to carry it differently. His daily routine was simple. After morning coffee, he'd feed Chester and check on his small herd of cattle, just 15 head now, manageable for a man of 76, with a bum right knee that reminded him of every rough landing from his rodeo days. He'd mend fences when they needed mending, keep his equipment maintained, and generally occupy himself with the small tasks that fill a retired rancher's days. Afternoons usually meant a trip into town, to the feed store where Sarah Chen presided over an empire of seed, grain, and local knowledge. Sarah had moved to Ridgeline 20 years ago from Seattle, chasing a dream of rural simplicity that had mostly worked out. She was 55, sharp-minded, with black hair she wore in a practical braid, and an ability to remember every customer's usual order. Her store was more than a place to buy supplies. It was where news traveled, where problems got solved, and where Sarah dispensed advice with the same efficiency she dispensed 40-pound bags of feed. Hank considered her a friend, one of the few people whose company he actively sought rather than simply tolerated. They'd bonded over their mutual status as relative outsiders, she by geography, he by temperament. While other ranchers gathered in loud groups, trading exaggerations and slapping backs, Hank and Sarah would share quiet conversations about nothing much at all, the kind of talk that fills space without demanding anything. It was at the feed store, on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, that Hank first heard about the donkey. He'd come in for chicken feed, Chester waiting in the truck bed, when he overheard Tom Whitfield holding court near the cash register. Tom was 63, thick through the shoulders, with a handlebar mustache he was unreasonably proud of. He ran a successful cattle operation north of town and had the confidence of a man who'd rarely failed at anything he attempted, which made his current story all the more noteworthy. 3 days I gave it, Tom was saying to a cluster of younger ranchers. 3 days of trying every trick I know, and that demon wouldn't let me within 10 feet without trying to kick my head off. Tell you what, I've broken horses that fought less than that miserable beast. What did Ellen say when you gave up? Someone asked. Tom shrugged, looking uncomfortable. What could she say? I told her straight that animal's dangerous, got a mean streak a mile wide. She's better off putting it down before somebody gets killed. Hank paused in the aisle, listening. Ellen Grayson was a widow who ran a small ranch on the eastern edge of the valley, a woman who'd struggled since her husband passed 3 years ago but refused to sell out and move to town. Hank respected her stubbornness, recognized in it something of his own refusal to let go of the life he'd built with Martha. Sarah caught his eye from behind. The counter raised an eyebrow in silent question. Hank gave a small shake of his head, not now, and continued gathering his supplies, but the conversation followed him. Tom kept talking, and others chimed in with their own encounters with Ellen's donkey. Jake Morrison, a young wrangler barely 30 with more confidence than common sense, described getting kicked so hard it fractured his forearm. Fast as lightning, Jake said, cradling his arm in its sling. Didn't even see it coming. 1 second I'm reaching for its halter, next second I'm on the ground, wondering if my arm's broken. Doctor, Reynolds went out to look at it last week, Sarah interjected, her voice cutting through the masculine bluster. Told Ellen the kindest thing would be to put it down. Said it's too far gone, too aggressive to ever be useful. The words settled over the group like a judgment. In a ranching community, usefulness mattered. An animal that couldn't be worked, couldn't be trusted, was just a mouth to feed and a liability waiting to happen. The practical choice was clear, but Hank found himself troubled by the consensus. He paid for his supplies, loaded them into his truck, while Chester supervised, and drove the long way home, past Ellen's property. He could see the corral from the road, and in it, a dark shape pacing back and forth like a prisoner in a cell. That night, he couldn't settle. He sat on the porch as the stars emerged, one of Martha's old quilts wrapped around his shoulders against the April chill, and thought about that donkey, thought about what makes an animal mean, thought about Tom Whitfield's certainty and Jake Morrison's broken arm and Dr. Reynolds' professional recommendation, thought about a horse named Tornado and how everyone had said it couldn't be ridden until someone took the time to understand what made it buck. Chester whined softly, picking up on Hank's unrest. Hank scratched behind the dog's ears, staring out at the darkness beyond his porch. Light's reach. Somewhere in that darkness, a frightened animal was waiting to be condemned for being exactly what life had made it. "What do you think, old friend?" Hank asked Chester. "Still got one more difficult creature in me?" Chester's tail thumped once against the porch boards. Hank took it as encouragement, or at least as the absence of objection. He went to bed that night with his mind made up, though he couldn't have explained exactly why. Maybe it was the memory of Martha saying he had a gift with broken things. Maybe it was having too much time and not enough purpose since she'd passed. Or maybe it was simply that he understood what it felt like to be written off by people who couldn't see past the surface pain to the hurt underneath. Morning came with its familiar rituals, but Hank moved through them with a new sense of direction. He drank his coffee quickly, checked on the cattle with efficiency rather than his usual meandering pace, and was backing his truck out of the driveway by 8 o'clock, earlier than he'd been anywhere in months. Ellen Grayson's ranch would be his destination. He didn't call ahead, didn't want to give her a chance to talk him out of coming. Some decisions, Hank had learned, were easier to act on than to explain. As he drove, Chester beside him with his head out the window, Hank felt something he hadn't experienced in the 5 years since Martha died. He felt necessary. He felt like, maybe, just maybe, he had one more important thing to do before his own time ran out. And whether that thing was saving a donkey or saving himself from the slow erosion of purposelessness, he supposed it didn't much matter. Sometimes the healing goes both ways, and the one doing the rescuing needs it just as badly as the one being rescued. Ellen Grayson's ranch showed the wear of 3 years without a partner. The main house paint was peeling, the barn door hung crooked on its hinges, and the fencing had been patched in places with whatever materials came to hand. But the property was clean, the animals looked healthy, and Hank recognized in the careful maintenance the work of someone determined not to let standards slip, despite the odds. Ellen met him at the porch as he pulled up, wiping her hands on her jeans. She was 68, her face weathered by sun and hardship into deep lines that somehow made her more handsome rather than less. Her grey hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail, and her eyes held the particular wariness of someone who'd learned to be suspicious of help that came with strings attached. "Hank McCallister," she said, by way of greeting. "Didn't expect to see you out this way. Heard you've got a problem animal," Hank replied, climbing down from his truck with the stiffness that came from his bum knee. Chester hopped out after him, staying close. "Thought I might take a look, if you're willing." Ellen's expression shifted through surprise into something that might have been hope, except hope seemed like a dangerous thing to allow. "You heard about my donkey then? I suppose the whole valley's heard by now." She gestured toward the eastern pasture. "He's out in the isolation corral. Been there for 6 months now, ever since he put Jake Morrison in the emergency room." They walked together, Ellen leading the way along a dirt path, worn smooth by years of use. She talked as they went, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd run out of options. "Got him 2 years ago from a trader passing through. Man seemed nervous, eager to make the deal and move on. Should have been my first warning, but I needed something to pack supplies into the back pasture, and the price was right." She shook her head. "Turned out wrong from day one. Wouldn't let anyone touch him. Kicked at everything that moved, bit through a leather-led rope like it was paper." The corral came into view, a stout fenced enclosure about 40 feet square. Inside, Hank got his first clear look at the donkey, and what he saw made his chest tighten with recognition. The animal was dark brown, almost black, with a lighter muzzle and rings around its eyes that made it look perpetually startled. It couldn't have weighed more than 400 pounds, small for a donkey, with a coat that was matted and dull despite access to adequate food. But it was the scars that told the real story, crisscrossing marks along its flanks, a circular brand on its left shoulder that looked amateur and cruel, and most telling, deep rope burns around its neck that had healed into white ridges of tissue. When Hank approached the fence, the donkey's head snapped up. Its ears went flat against its skull, nostrils flaring, and it charged straight at the fence line with a sound that was half bray, half scream. The impact of its hooves on the hard-packed earth sent small clouds of dust rising, and Hank could see the whites of its eyes, the foam at the corners of its mouth. This wasn't meanness. This was terror given teeth and hooves. "You see," Ellen said, staying well back. "He's like that with everyone. Tom Whitfield lasted 3 days before he gave up. Jake thought he could muscle through it, got his arm broken for the trouble. Even Dr. Reynolds said there's nothing to be done except put him down humanely before he kills someone." Hank stood at the fence, not moving away despite the donkey's aggressive display. The animal stopped 10 feet from the barrier, pawing the ground, sides heaving. They regarded each other across the distance, and Hank saw something in those wild eyes that everyone else had missed or chosen not to see. "When's he scheduled for?" Hank asked quietly. "Dr. Reynolds is coming Friday. That's 8 days from now." Ellen's voice cracked slightly. "I don't want to do it, Hank. Feels like giving up. But I can't keep an animal this dangerous, and I can't sell him in good conscience. What else can I do?" Hank turned to face her. "Let me try. Give me the week." Ellen blinked. "Try what?" "Tom Whitfield's been handling horses and mules for 40 years, and he couldn't—" "Tom's a good man," Hank interrupted gently. "But he approaches animals like problems to be solved, force and dominance. It works, for some." He looked back at the donkey, who was still watching him with that mixture of rage and fear. "But not for this one. This one's been forced enough. What would you do different? Just sit with him. Be present. Let him learn that not everything that walks on 2 legs means him harm." Ellen pulled a crumpled envelope from her back pocket, the kind that might have contained a sympathy card or a bill. "I can't pay much," she said, holding it out. "Got about $200 set aside. It's yours if you can help him." Hank didn't take the envelope. "Keep your money, Ellen. I'm not doing this for pay." "Then why?" It was a fair question, one Hank had been asking himself on the drive over. He chose his words carefully. "My Martha used to say I had a way with broken things. Said it came from being broken myself once and finding my way back." He paused, watching the donkey pace along the far fence line. 5 years she's been gone, and I've been wondering if maybe she was wrong, if that part of me died with her. This feels like a way to find out." Ellen tucked the envelope back into her pocket, her eyes bright with unshed tears. 8 days, then. If you can give him reason to live, I'll be grateful. If not—" She didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what came next. Hank spent the next hour just observing. He pulled an overturned bucket close to the fence and sat, Chester lying calmly at his feet. The donkey paced endlessly, never settling, always positioning itself with its hindquarters to the fence corner, a defensive stance that spoke of hard experience. Every few minutes it would glance at Hank, ears flat, muscles tense for flight or fight. Hank noticed everything. The slight favor of the left hind leg, the way the animal flinched at sudden movements, how it watched the gate with particular intensity, as if expecting something terrible to come through it at any moment. These were the details that told the real story, the language of trauma written in posture and reaction. When he finally stood to leave, his knee protesting the long sit, the donkey backed to the farthest corner and watched him with those wild, frightened eyes. Hank spoke for the first time, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what they did to you, friend, but I promise you this, whatever time we have, you won't feel that kind of fear from me." The drive home passed in contemplation. Chester sensed his mood and stayed quiet, a warm presence in the passenger seat. Hank's mind was already working through approaches, timelines, what success might even look like with an animal this damaged. He'd handled difficult horses in his time, had brought plenty of green colts along to reliable mounts, but this was different. This was an animal that had learned humans meant pain, and unlearning that would take more than horsemanship. It would take something closer to faith. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Hank lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Martha's side of the mattress still somehow feeling empty after 5 years. He thought about what he'd committed to, wondered if maybe he was being foolish. Tom Whitfield was no amateur, and if he couldn't reach that donkey, what made Hank think he could? But then he remembered the look in the animal's eyes, remembered other frightened creatures he'd helped along the way, remembered Martha's voice saying he had a gift, and how that gift wasn't really about animals at all. It was about patience, about sitting with discomfort, about offering presence without demand. By dawn, doubt had settled into determination. He rose with the sun, made his coffee, and added one more item to the morning routine. From the hall closet, he pulled out his old rodeo bag and rummaged until he found what he was looking for, the silver championship buckle from 1972, the one he'd won on Tornado. He held it in his palm, feeling its weight. That buckle represented the moment he'd learned that every wild thing has its reasons, and patience beats force every time. If he was going to do this right, he needed to remember that lesson. The donkey had 8 days before its scheduled destruction. Hank intended to make every one of them count. Day 2 dawned clear and cold, the kind of Montana spring morning where frost still clung to the grass, despite the calendar's insistence on warmer weather. Hank arrived at Ellen's ranch before the sun cleared the eastern ridge, his truck bed loaded with supplies that would have seemed odd to anyone expecting traditional animal training equipment. A weathered folding camp stool, its canvas seat faded from years of hunting trips and riverside fishing, a large thermos of coffee, a worn paperback western, and Chester, who hopped down from the cab with the casual dignity of a dog who'd learned long ago that humans did strange things, and it was best to simply go along. Ellen watched from her kitchen window as Hank set up his stool 20 feet from the corral fence, far enough not to be threatening, close enough to be present. The donkey stood at the far end of the enclosure, every muscle tense, ears flat against its skull. Hank sat down with a small grunt. His knee always complained about the first bend of the day, and poured himself a cup of coffee. Chester settled beside him, chin resting on his paws, the picture of calm contentment. And then Hank simply sat there. He talked, his voice low and steady, about nothing of particular consequence, about how the frost made the grass sparkle like crushed diamonds, about the hawk he'd seen circling on the drive over, about the way spring smelled different in Montana than anywhere else, sharp and clean and full of possibility. The donkey watched him, sides heaving, ready to bolt or fight at the first sign of danger. Hank didn't approach, didn't stand up, didn't make any move toward the animal at all. He just sat on his stool, sipping coffee, occasionally scratching Chester's ears, and maintained his gentle monologue about the weather and the mountains and the way light changed as morning turned to day. Ellen came out mid-morning, concern written across her face. "Hank, you've been sitting there 3 hours. Don't you want to—" "Not yet," Hank said softly. "Today's just about being here, showing him that people can be present without being a threat." Ellen looked skeptical but said nothing more. She had her own work to attend to, fences that needed mending and cattle that needed tending. She left Hank to his vigil, shaking her head at the strangeness of a man sitting motionless beside a corral, talking to an animal that clearly wanted nothing to do with him. But Hank noticed things Ellen couldn't see from a distance. The way the donkey's ears, while still back, occasionally flicked forward for a split second when Hank spoke, the slight decrease in the animal's pacing from constant motion to brief pauses, the way its head lowered just a fraction, moving from high alert to merely vigilant. These were small victories, invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. But Hank had spent decades reading animals, understanding that communication happened in inches and moments rather than grand gestures. Every flick of an ear was a conversation. Every shift in posture was progress. Day 3 brought the same routine. Hank arrived at dawn, set up his stool, and settled in for the long morning. Chester had already learned the pattern, lying down immediately with a contented sigh. The donkey watched them from the far corner, still tense, but perhaps fractionally less panicked than the day before. Sarah Chen drove out that afternoon, her feed store truck pulling up the drive with a rattle of loose tools in. The bed. She climbed out carrying 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and a look of friendly concern. "Ellen called me," Sarah said, handing Hank one of the sandwiches. "Said you've been sitting out here like a statue for 2 days straight. Wanted me to check if you'd lost your mind." Hank accepted the sandwich with a grateful nod. "Still got my mind. Just using it different than most folks would." Sarah studied the donkey, who had retreated even further at her arrival. Tom Whitfield tried to work with him for 3 days. Came at it with ropes and patience and 50 years of experience. What makes you think sitting still is going to work any better? Tom tried to make the donkey come to him on Tom's timeline, Hank replied, unwrapping the sandwich roast beef, his favorite. "I'm just offering to be here on the donkey's timeline instead." Big difference. That's a philosophical approach to an animal that's proven dangerous. Philosophy's all I've got at my age. Hank took a bite, chewed thoughtfully. "Can't outmuscle it, can't outrun it. All I can do is outweight it." Sarah sat on the ground beside his stool, her own sandwich balanced on her knee. They ate in companionable silence for a while, watching the donkey watch them back. Finally, Sarah spoke again, her voice softer. "This about the donkey, Hank, or about something else?" It was a fair question. Hank considered it carefully before answering. "Martha used to say, I understood frightened things because I'd been frightened myself once. Took me years to figure out what she meant, but I think it was about the rodeo." He paused, memory pulling him back. All those young men trying to prove themselves against animals 10 times their size. Fear dressed up as courage. Most of us never admitted how scared we really were. And the donkey reminds you of that? The donkey reminds me that everything acting out in aggression is usually just scared underneath, and that healing scared things takes more patience than most people have. Sarah finished her sandwich, brushed crumbs from her jeans. "Well, you've got 5 more days before Dr. Reynolds comes. I hope your patience is enough." After she left, Hank continued his vigil. He pulled out his paperback Western, read aloud in the same conversational tone he'd been using. The donkey's ears pricked forward at the different cadence, the story about cowboys and cattle drives and the old frontier. Hank read for an hour, Chester dozing beside him, the afternoon sun warm on his shoulders. Day 4 brought rain. Hank sat under an umbrella, water dripping from its edges, the stool sinking slightly into mud that formed around its legs. The donkey stood in the downpour, soaked and miserable, but refusing the shelter of the small lean-to Ellen had built in one corner of the corral. "I know what it's like," Hank said to the animal, his voice carrying across the rain-dimmed space between them. "Being so hurt you can't accept help, even when you need it. Martha spent the first year of our marriage trying to convince me I deserved kindness. Took me a long time to believe her." The donkey's ears flicked forward and stayed there for 5 full seconds. The longest yet. Day 5 brought the first major breakthrough. Hank arrived, set up his stool, settled in with his coffee and Chester. The donkey was in its usual corner, watching with its usual wariness. But an hour into the morning sit, the animal did something it had never done while Hank was present. It lay down. The movement was careful, legs folding beneath its body, head remaining upright and alert. But it was lying down, showing a level of relaxation that had been absent in every previous encounter. Hank kept his reaction minimal, no sudden movements, no exclamations, but his heart lifted with the first real confirmation that progress was possible. Day 6 brought another rain shower, and this time the donkey used the lean-to shelter, though it watched Hank with unblinking intensity the entire time, as if expecting punishment for choosing comfort. Hank stayed on his stool, umbrella overhead, and talked about storms he'd weathered, both literal and metaphorical. about loss and adaptation and learning to live with holes that never quite filled in. Day 7 arrived with clear skies and new warmth, and Hank took a calculated risk. He moved his stool 5 feet closer to the corral fence. The donkey's head shot up, nostrils flaring, every muscle tensing for flight. But it didn't charge, didn't even retreat. It stood its ground at the far end, watching this new development with evident anxiety, but not with panic. Hank sat down carefully. Every movement, deliberate and slow. Chester settled beside him, and they resumed the routine that had become familiar. Hank talking, the morning passing in patient stillness, the donkey gradually accepting this new distance as the day wore on. By afternoon, the animal was lying down again, 35 feet, away but no longer actively fleeing from Hank's presence. It was progress measured in feet and moments, invisible to anyone looking for dramatic transformation. But to Hank, who understood that trust was built in whispers rather than shouts, it was everything. Week 2 began with a change in approach. Hank arrived with his usual supplies, stool, coffee, Chester, but also with something he hadn't touched in 5 years. Martha's harmonica, a small honer with a worn wooden casing, lived in his glove compartment, where he'd placed it the day after her funeral and never moved it since. He sat on his stool, closer now than he'd been the first week, and after his usual morning greeting to the donkey, he pulled out the harmonica. His fingers remembered the weight of it, the feel of the smooth wood against his palms. Martha had played it on summer evenings, simple tunes from her childhood, melodies that spoke of simpler times. Hank played Red River Valley, the notes wavering slightly, from lack of practice, but the melody clear enough. The donkey's reaction was immediate. Its ears pricked forward, the first time they'd moved fully out of the defensive position. Its head tilted slightly, nostrils flaring as it tried to make sense of this new stimulus. Hank played through the song twice, then transitioned into Home on the Range, letting the music speak what words couldn't. The donkey took 3 steps closer, still cautious, but unmistakably curious. When Hank finished the second song, he lowered the harmonica and simply sat, letting the silence settle like dust after wind. "She played better than me," Hank said to the donkey. "Martha, my wife, she could make this little thing sing like a bird. Used to play every evening on the porch, and I'd sit there thinking I was the luckiest man alive." The donkey's ears remained forward, listening. On the 3rd day of week 2, Hank brought a bucket of fresh water and set it just inside the corral gate. He didn't approach. The donkey didn't try to force interaction, just placed the bucket and retreated to his stool. The donkey watched the entire process with deep suspicion, but after Hank had been sitting for an hour, it cautiously approached the bucket, sniffed, and drank. It was the first time the animal had accepted something Hank provided. The first direct exchange between them that didn't involve fear or distance. Hank kept his expression neutral, didn't celebrate or react, but inside he felt the small spark of connection beginning to catch. Day 4 brought an unexpected visitor. Jake Morrison's truck pulled up mid-morning, and the young wrangler climbed out with his arm still in a sling from the donkey's kick 3 weeks earlier. He approached Hank's position with visible discomfort, pride and curiosity warring on his face. "Heard you've been out here every day," Jake said by way of greeting. "Wanted to see what the secret was." "No secret," Hank replied mildly. "Just time and patience." Jake studied the donkey, which had retreated to the far corner at his arrival. "Time and patience. That's what my grandfather used to say about breaking horses. Course, he'd also use a rope and a firm hand when time ran short. Your grandfather probably got results," Hank acknowledged. "But there's different kinds of results. You can break an animal's will and call it trained, or you can earn its trust and call it partnership. The second way takes longer." "It does, but it lasts longer too." Jake stood there for a moment, wrestling with something. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quieter. "When that donkey kicked me, I was angry. Felt like a personal insult, you know, like it was choosing to be mean." He touched his sling. But watching you sit here, talking to it like it's a friend, makes me wonder if I misunderstood the whole situation. Fear looks a lot like meanness when you're on the receiving end, Hank said. But if you look close enough, you can usually tell the some difference. That donkey wasn't being mean when it kicked you. It was being terrified. Jake nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his expression. He stayed for another hour, sitting on the ground near Hank's stool, learning the art of simply being present. The donkey gradually relaxed again, accepting Jake's presence because Hank had vouched for him through his own calm. When Jake left, he thanked Hank with genuine warmth. "Maybe I've been going about this all wrong," he said. "The horses, the cattle, maybe force isn't always the answer." "Force has its place," Hank replied, "but understanding ought to come first." Day 5 brought the biggest risk yet. Hank decided it was time to enter the corral properly, not just to leave water, but to occupy the same space as the donkey. He moved slowly, every action telegraphed well in advance, and stepped through the gate carrying the water bucket. The donkey's response was immediate and dramatic. It charged, head down, ears flat, closing the distance between them in seconds. Hank stood absolutely still, bucket in hand, making himself as small a threat as possible. The donkey stopped 6 feet away, hooves planted, sides heaving, clearly prepared to fight if necessary. "I know you're scared," Hank said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know every person who's come in here has meant pain or force or something you couldn't control, but I'm not them. I'm just an old man who wants to help, if you'll let me." They stood frozen in that tableau for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The donkey's eyes were wild, showing white, its breath coming in sharp snorts, but it didn't attack, didn't kick, just held its ground in defensive threat. Hank, slowly, carefully, lowered the bucket to the ground. Then, moving with glacial patience, he backed toward the gate. The donkey watched every inch of his retreat, muscles coiled, but made no move to pursue. When Hank exited the corral and closed the gate behind him, his hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline of the confrontation. Ellen had watched the whole thing from her porch. She walked over, her face pale. "Hank, that was necessary," he finished. "Had to show him I'd enter his space, but also respect his boundaries. Had to prove I wouldn't push past his limits. What if he'd actually kicked you?" Hank shrugged. "Then I'd have learned I moved too fast. But he didn't kick. He warned. And I listened." That's the whole conversation right there. Days 6 and 7 followed the same pattern. Hank would enter the corral to deliver water. The donkey would charge and stop short. Hank would retreat. But each time, the donkey stopped a little sooner, seemed a fraction less panicked by the intrusion. The charge was becoming ritual rather than genuine threat, a way of establishing boundaries that Hank consistently respected. On the 7th evening, Hank drove into town and spent an hour at the public library's computer researching donkey behavior and trauma response in livestock. What he found confirmed his instincts. Animals that had been abused or severely mistreated could recover, but only if given agency in the process. The healing couldn't be forced any more than the original trust could be. He shared what he'd learned with Sarah over coffee at the diner. She listened thoughtfully, then said, "You know Ellen's got 2 more days before Dr. Reynolds comes. Do you think you're going to make enough progress?" Hank considered the question carefully. "I don't know if 2 days is enough to save that donkey's life in the way Ellen needs, but I know he's different than he was 10 days ago. Less scared, more willing to take risks. That's got to count for something. What if it's not enough? Then at least his last days were spent learning that not all humans are cruel. That's more than he had before I showed up." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed his hand briefly. "You're a good man, Hank McCallister. Just a patient one," he replied. "Patience is easier when you've got more time behind you than ahead. Makes you appreciate the small moments more." That night, lying in bed, with Chester snoring softly at the foot, Hank thought about the past 2 weeks, about the incremental progress and the long hours of simply being present, about how healing worked in whispers and small surrenders rather than dramatic breakthroughs. about how he'd felt more alive in these 14 days than in the 5 years since Martha died. The donkey had 2 days left. Hank intended to make them matter. Week 3 dawned with unexpected discovery. Hank was placing the morning water bucket when his boot caught on something partially buried in the corral dirt. He knelt carefully his knee, protesting the movement, and brushed away the loose soil to reveal a length of rope. It was old, frayed at both ends where it had been broken rather than cut, but it was the condition of the rope that made Hank's stomach turn. Dark stains that could only be old blood marked the braided fibers. The rope had been knotted in multiple places, tied so tightly it had clearly cut into whatever it had restrained. One section showed teeth marks where something had desperately tried to chew through. Hank pulled it free from the dirt and held it in his hands, feeling the weight of evidence. This rope told a story more clearly than words ever could. The donkey had been tied up, probably for extended periods, had fought against the restraint until it bled, had tried to gnaw itself free. The trauma wasn't theoretical or guessed at, it was right here, documented in blood and fiber. He showed the rope to Ellen when she came out to check on him. Her face went pale as she examined it, turning it over in her hands with growing horror. "That trader," she said quietly, "the one who sold me the donkey. He left so fast, wouldn't even stay for coffee, said he had to make the next town before dark, but it was barely noon." She looked at the donkey, who was watching them from the far corner. "What do you think happened?" "I think someone tied him up and left him that way. Maybe for days at a time, probably beat him when he fought back." Hank took the rope back, coiled it carefully. "Animals don't forget that kind of treatment. It stays in their bones. Should we tell Dr. Reynolds? Maybe he'll take pity and do it quick instead of slow," Hank finished. "But either way, Ellen, that donkey's running out of time. Reynolds is due tomorrow." Ellen's eyes filled. "I know. I wanted to believe you could fix this." "I can't fix what was done to him," Hank said gently. "Nobody can. But maybe, if we're lucky, he can learn to trust despite it. That's the best any of us can do with our scars." That afternoon, Hank adjusted his approach. He entered the corral, carrying apples and carrots in his pockets, moving with his now familiar slow deliberation. The donkey went through its ritual charge, stopping 8 feet away this time, noticeably closer than previous days. Hank didn't retreat immediately. Instead, he pulled an apple slice from his pocket and tossed it gently to land halfway between them. The donkey eyed the apple, then Hank, then the apple again. It didn't approach while Hank remained in the corral, but when he left and resumed his position on the stool outside, the animal cautiously walked over and ate the slice. It was acceptance, tentative and conditional, but acceptance nonetheless. Tom Whitfield drove out that evening, his truck pulling up just as Hank was preparing to leave. The older rancher climbed out slowly, his expression unreadable. "Heard you've been at this for 2 weeks, Tom said. "Came to see for myself." Hank waited, letting Tom set the tone of the conversation. "Also came to say I was wrong," Tom continued, the admission clearly difficult for a man of his pride. "Wrong about that donkey being mean, wrong about the bicker. Only solution being to put it down." He gestured toward the corral. "Watched you for 10 minutes before I made myself known. Saw that animal eating from your hand well, eating what you'd thrown, anyway. That's more progress than I made in 3 days of trying." "You didn't have the information I have," Hank replied, showing Tom the rope. "Found this buried in the corral. Changes the whole picture." Tom examined the rope, his weathered face hardening with anger. "That's criminal. Someone ought to find that trader and—" He stopped, shook his head. "But that doesn't change that you succeeded where I failed. There's a lesson in that, and I'm man enough to learn it. The lesson's just patience, Tom. And I've got more of it than you, because I've got less to hurry toward." The next morning brought Dr. Reynolds, arriving early with his medical bag and the necessary equipment for euthanasia. He was a compact man in his 50s, efficient and professional, with kind eyes that had seen too many animals put down over the years. Ellen met him in the driveway, Hank beside her. "Before you make any final decisions," Ellen said, I want you to observe what Hank's accomplished. Doctor. Reynolds was skeptical but agreed. They walked to the corral together, where the donkey stood watching their approach with its usual wariness. But when Hank entered through the gate, something remarkable happened. The donkey didn't charge. It stood its ground, tense but not aggressive, allowing Hank to walk to the center of the corral. Hank pulled apple slices from his pocket and placed them on the ground, then retreated to his stool just outside the fence. After a moment's hesitation, the donkey approached and ate, keeping one eye on the humans, but clearly less panicked than it had been 3 weeks earlier. Doctor. Reynolds watched in silence for 20 minutes, his professional assessment running through visible calculations. Finally, he spoke. I'll admit, that's not the same animal I examined 2 weeks ago. The body language is completely different, less reactive, more measured. The physical health improvements are obvious. Better coat condition, healthier weight, more alert but less hypervigilant. So, you'll give him more time? Ellen asked hopefully. I'll give him a month, Dr. Reynolds said. But Ellen, if he regresses, if he shows any sign of returning to aggressive behavior, we'll need to reconsider. I can't in good conscience leave a dangerous animal on your property indefinitely. After the vet left, Ellen threw her arms around Hank in an impulsive hug. You did it. You actually did it. Did part of it, Hank corrected gently. Bought him time. What happens in that time is still to be determined. But he felt the weight of the reprieve, like a physical thing. 1 month, 30 days, to turn tentative progress into something sustainable. It was a gift and a challenge in equal measure. That evening, Hank called his daughter Emily. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice carrying the particular warmth she reserved for him. Dad, I was just thinking about you. How's the donkey project going? He told her about Dr. Reynolds' visit, about the month's extension, about the slow, incremental progress that had led to this reprieve. Emily listened with the patience she'd inherited from her mother, asking questions that showed she understood both what he was saying and what he wasn't. You sound different, she observed. More I don't know, more present, I guess, more like yourself. Feel more like myself, Hank admitted. These past few weeks, working with this broken animal, it's reminded me that I still have purpose, still have something to offer. You've always had purpose, Dad. You've just been lost in the grief for a while. Maybe the donkey needed you, but I think you needed him too. After they said their goodbyes, Hank sat on his porch with Chester, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Emily was right, of course. The healing had been going both directions all along. He'd been so focused on the donkey's trauma that he'd missed his own slow emergence from the shell of grief that had encased him since Martha's death. 1 month. It would be enough time to see this through. It had to be. Week 4 brought a shift in Hank's approach. He'd been thinking about vulnerability, about how trust required both parties to take risks. So, when he arrived on Monday morning, he brought something he'd never shared outside his home, a photograph of himself and Martha at a rodeo 45 years earlier, both of them young and grinning, like they'd discovered the secret to life. He sat on his stool, the photograph in his weathered hands, and for the first time spoke to the donkey, not about the weather or books or nothing in particular, but about something that mattered deeply. "This is Martha," he said, holding the photograph toward the donkey as if the animal could see it across the 30 feet between them. "My wife. She died 5 years ago come August, and there's not a day since that I haven't felt the hole she left." The donkey's ears were forward, that attentive posture Hank had come to recognize as listening. He continued, his voice steady despite the emotion threading through it. "We had 46 years together. Started at that rodeo where this picture was taken. She was selling tickets at the gate, and I was young and stupid enough to think winning buckles made me somebody special." He smiled at the memory. "She saw right through all that swagger to the scared kid underneath. Took me 2 years to convince her to marry me, another year to convince her I'd grow into the man she deserved." The donkey took 3 steps closer. The first time it had voluntarily reduced distance while Hank was speaking. Hank carefully didn't react, just kept talking. After she passed, people kept telling me I needed to move on, get back to living. Like grief was something you could schedule around, like you could just decide when you were done feeling the loss. He shook his head. But healing doesn't work like that. It takes however long it takes, and pushing it just makes the wound deeper. He looked directly at the donkey. I think you understand that. I think someone tried to force you past your fear and pain, and all it did was make you more frightened. Well, I'm here to tell you, both of us, that it's okay to take the time we need. There's no rush on healing. On Tuesday, Hank tried something new. When he entered the corral with the water bucket, he extended his hand palm down, standing completely still. The donkey went through its now familiar response, ears back, slight tension but didn't charge. Instead, it stretched its neck out, nostrils flaring, and sniffed the air between them. 5 feet separated Hank's hand from the donkey's muzzle, 5 feet that might as well have been a canyon for how much trust would be required to bridge it. Hank held his position for a full minute before slowly withdrawing and leaving the corral. The donkey watched him go, and Hank could have sworn there was something like disappointment in its eyes. Wednesday brought Jake Morrison back, this time by invitation. Hank had called him the night before, asked if he'd like to learn more about the patient approach to animal training. Jake arrived eager and humble, the cockiness that had characterized his first visit replaced by genuine curiosity. First thing you need to understand, Hank said as they sat together outside the corral, is that every animal is having a conversation with you. But they're speaking in body language, not words. You have to learn to listen with your eyes instead of your ears. He walked Jake through what he'd observed over the past weeks. The incremental changes in the donkey's posture, ear positions, breathing patterns, how a shift of weight could indicate relaxation or preparation for flight, how the animal's eyes showed fear or curiosity or the beginning of trust. It's like reading a book in a foreign language, Jake said. You have to learn what each sign means before you can understand the whole message. Exactly, and you can't rush that learning. Some animals speak loud, others whisper. This one's been hurt so bad he's almost silent. You have to pay attention to the smallest things. Hank invited Jake into the corral with him, moving slowly, telegraphing every intention. The donkey tensed at Jake's presence, but didn't retreat to the far corner. It held its ground, watching both men with wary attention. Just stand here, Hank instructed quietly. Don't move toward him, don't talk to him, just be present. Let him learn that you being here doesn't mean pain. They stood together for 20 minutes, and gradually the donkey relaxed. Not completely, there was still tension in its frame, still readiness for flight, but enough that it lay down while they were in the corral. It was transferred trust. The donkey, accepting Jake because Hank vouched for him through his own calm presence. That's remarkable, Jake breathed, barely moving his lips. It's learning that not all humans are the same, learning that some humans can be trusted, Hank corrected, and that's the hardest lesson for anything that's been deeply hurt. Easier to assume everyone's dangerous than to risk being hurt again. Thursday brought the moment Hank had been working toward for a month. He entered the corral as usual, but this time didn't immediately place the water bucket and retreat. Instead, he sat down cross-legged in the center of the space, making himself as non-threatening as possible. Chester lay beside him, the dog's presence a constant reassurance to both Hank and the donkey. The donkey stood at the far end, clearly uncertain about this change in routine. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. Hank simply sat, breathing steadily, occasionally murmuring soft words. Then, with the hesitation that spoke of enormous internal struggle, the donkey took one step forward, then another, then another. It approached with agonizing slowness, stopping after each step to reassess the risk. Hank remained absolutely motionless, barely allowing himself to breathe. The donkey came within 10 feet, then 8, then 6. At 6 feet it stopped. They regarded each other across that small distance, and Hank could see every emotion playing across the animal's face: fear, curiosity, the desperate want for connection warring with the learned knowledge that connection meant pain. "You're doing fine," Hank whispered. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." The donkey stood there for 15 minutes, occasionally pawing the ground, ears flicking back and forth between defensive and curious. Then, in a moment that took Hank's breath away, it lowered its head and took one more step forward. 5 feet. Close enough that Hank could see the scars on its legs in detail, could count the individual hairs in its mane, could smell the warm animal scent of it. Close enough to touch, though Hank kept his hands carefully to himself. They stayed frozen in that tableau, human and animal, both scarred by life, both learning to trust again. When the donkey finally retreated, backing away slowly before turning and walking to the far corner, Hank let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Ellen had watched the entire encounter from her porch. When Hank exited the corral, she was waiting with tears streaming down her face. "He came to you," she said, wonder in her voice. "He chose to come closer. He's deciding whether trust is worth the risk," Hank replied, his own voice unsteady. "That's all any of us can do, decide if the possibility of connection is worth risking the pain that might come with it." That evening, Hank sat on his own porch with Chester, the photograph of Martha resting on the arm of his chair. He thought about his conversation with the donkey, about how he'd been talking to himself as much as to the animal, about how healing required vulnerability from both the wounded and the healer. He'd spent 5 years protecting himself from further loss by refusing to let anything matter too much. But this donkey had cracked that protective shell, had shown him that life without risk was just another kind of death. Martha would have approved, he thought. She'd always believed the world needed more people willing to sit with broken things until they remembered how to be whole. The stranger arrived on a Friday afternoon, his truck pulling up Ellen's drive with the tentative slowness of someone who wasn't sure of their welcome. Hank was in the corral, sitting cross-legged as had become his custom, the donkey lying down 12 feet away, the closest it had yet allowed him to remain for an extended period. The truck door opened, and a man stepped out, maybe 50 years old, wearing work clothes that had seen better days, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He stood by his vehicle for a moment, hands shoved in his pockets, staring at the corral with an expression Hank couldn't quite read from a distance. Ellen emerged from her house, her posture immediately defensive. Hank recognized the man's face, even from 40 feet away, the nervous energy, the way he shifted his weight from foot to foot. This was the trader who'd sold Ellen the donkey 2 years ago. Hank climbed to his feet slowly, his knee protesting as always, and exited the corral. Chester stayed close, picking up on the tension in the air. The donkey had risen as well, ears back, every muscle tight with sudden alarm. It recognized the stranger too. "Mrs. Grayson," the man was saying as Hank approached. "I know I got no right to show up here after so long, but I—" He stopped when he saw Hank, confusion crossing his face. "Who's this?" "This is Hank McCallister," Ellen said coldly. "He's been working with the donkey you sold me. The one you failed to mention was traumatized and dangerous." The man flinched. "That's actually why I'm here. I need to explain some things. And I need to see the donkey." "You can see it from here," Hank said, his voice level but firm. "But you're not going near that corral. That animal's finally learning to trust again, and I won't have you undoing a month's work." "A month?" The man looked genuinely surprised. "You've been working with him for a month?" "Every single day," Ellen confirmed. "Which is more than you did before dumping him on me with no warning about his condition." The stranger took off his cap, ran a hand through thinning hair. "My name's Carl Winters, and I didn't just dump that donkey on you, Mrs. Grayson. I was—" He paused, struggling with something. "I was trying to save his life." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. Hank studied Carl's face, reading the guilt and shame written there, and made a decision. "I think you'd better explain yourself." They moved to Ellen's porch, far enough from the corral not to agitate the donkey, but close enough to keep it in sight. Carl sat heavily on the steps, his hands clasped between his knees, and began to talk. 2.5 years ago, I was working at a ranch outside of Billings. Big operation, maybe 200 head of cattle, horses, the works. The owner's granddaughter, sweet kid named Amy, she'd raised that donkey from a foal, bottle-fed it, spent every day with it, treated it like a pet, called it Clover. Hank felt something shift in his understanding. The donkey had a name, had been loved. Amy was 12, Carl continued, and that donkey followed her everywhere, gentle as a lamb. They were inseparable. His voice cracked slightly. Then Amy got sick, leukemia. She fought it for 8 months before she passed. Ellen's hand went to her mouth. Hank remained still, letting Carl tell his story. After Amy died, her grandfather, the ranch owner, he couldn't stand to look at the donkey anymore. Said it reminded him too much of what he'd lost. He turned mean about it. Blamed the animal for surviving when his granddaughter didn't. Started neglecting it, leaving it tied up for days with no water, no care. Carl's hands clenched. I tried to intervene, tried to get him to sell the donkey or give it away. But he was grieving in the worst way, taking out his pain on something innocent. "So you stole it," Hank said quietly. "I freed it," Carl corrected, meeting Hank's eyes. "Found it tied to a fence post with that rope so tight it had cut into the skin. The animal was half-starved, terrified, and I knew if I left it there much longer it would die. So yes, I took it without permission. Loaded it in my trailer in the middle of the night and drove." "Why didn't you take it to a rescue?" Ellen asked. "I tried 3 places. They were all full. And when they heard about the aggression, because by then the donkey was fighting, anyone who came near they said they'd have to put it down. They didn't have the resources for an animal that dangerous." Carl looked at Ellen. "When I found you, advertising for a pack animal, I thought maybe a small operation, someone patient, might be able to reach it. I should have explained everything, I know that. But I was scared you'd refuse to take it if you knew the whole story." "You were right," Ellen admitted. "I would have refused, and the donkey would have died," Carl finished. "So I made a choice. Maybe not the right one, but the only one I could live with." Silence settled over them. Hank watched the donkey Clover pacing in the corral, and pieces began falling into place. The animal hadn't been raised with violence. It had known love, known gentle hands, known what it meant to trust, which made the betrayal of that trust through neglect and abuse all the more devastating. No wonder it had fought so hard. It had learned that love could turn to cruelty in an instant. "Why come back now?" Hank asked. "Because I heard through the ranching network about a man who'd spent a month teaching Ellen Grayson's aggressive donkey to trust again." Carl looked at Hank with something like hope. "I had to see if it was true, if maybe I did the right thing after all by giving him a chance." Hank considered this, turning over the implications. Then he stood. "Come with me, but move slow and stay quiet." He led Carl to the corral fence, positioning him where the donkey could see them clearly. The animal immediately tensed, recognizing Carl, but didn't retreat to the far corner as it would have a month ago. It held its ground, watching with those expressive eyes. "Clover," Carl called softly, his voice breaking on the name. "Hey there, Clover. It's been a long time." The donkey's ears flicked forward at the name. Something passed across its face, a flicker of recognition, of memory. It took one hesitant step toward them, then stopped, clearly torn between the pull of something familiar and the learned knowledge that humans brought pain. "I'm sorry," Carl continued, tears now visible on his weathered face. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect you better. Sorry I took so long to find a safe place for you. But you're safe now. This man here, he's helped you remember what it's like to be treated with kindness." The donkey Clover stood frozen, trembling slightly. Then it did something that made Carl gasp. It let out a low, mournful bray, the sound full of such profound sadness that it seemed to echo across the valley. It was the sound of grief, of loss, of a creature remembering what it once had and learning to accept what could never be again. "Amy's gone," Carl whispered. "But you're still here, and you deserve to be here, to have a life without fear. She would have wanted that for you." They stood there for a long moment, human and animal acknowledging shared loss and the impossibility of undoing the past. Then Carl stepped back from the fence, wiping his eyes with rough movements. "I won't bother you again," he said to Ellen and Hank. "Just needed to see that he was okay. Needed to know that running off with him in the middle of the night actually meant something." "It meant everything," Hank said firmly. "You saved this animal's life. What came after? The trauma and the fear. That wasn't your fault. You did what you could with what you had." Carl nodded, unable to speak. He walked back to his truck, climbed in, and drove away slowly, his hand raised in a final farewell to the donkey that had survived against all odds. After he left, Hank and Ellen stood together at the corral fence, watching Clover pace in agitated circles. The donkey's world had just shifted again, old memories stirred up by Carl's presence and the name it hadn't heard in years. "He was loved once," Ellen said softly. "That changes everything, doesn't it? Changes how we understand him." Hank agreed. "He's not just healing from abuse. He's grieving. Grieving the girl who loved him, the life he lost, the trust that was broken when the people who should have protected him turned cruel. Can you grieve and heal at the same time?" Hank thought about Martha, about the 5 years he'd spent in the fog of loss. "You have to," he said finally. "The grief doesn't end. You just learn to carry it while still living. That's what we're teaching Clover, that life goes on, that new trust is possible, even when the old trust was shattered." That night, Hank lay awake long past his usual bedtime, thinking about Carl Winters and a girl named Amy and a donkey called Clover, who had survived losing everything. The story had changed. What he'd thought was simple abuse was actually complex trauma, the loss of a beloved companion, grief twisted into cruelty by a grandfather who couldn't bear his pain, and a desperate rescue by a man with limited options. It made the healing more important somehow, more urgent. Clover deserved to know that not all love turned sour, that trust could be rebuilt, that the rest of his life didn't have to be defined by the worst thing that had happened to him. Hank understood that lesson intimately. He was still learning it himself. The revelation of Clover's past changed everything and nothing. The work remained the same, patient, consistent, respectful of boundaries, but Hank's understanding of what he was witnessing deepened. This wasn't just an abused animal learning to trust again. This was a creature working through grief, learning to accept that love could exist without the person who'd first taught it what love meant. The weekend after Carl's visit, Hank found himself thinking about Amy, trying to imagine her relationship with Clover. A 12-year-old girl and her devoted companion, spending days together in the innocent way that children and animals do, without complication or agenda. He wondered what games they'd played, what secrets she'd whispered into those soft ears, how the donkey had grieved when she disappeared. On Monday morning, Hank changed his approach slightly. Instead of entering the corral immediately, he sat on his stool and talked to Clover about Amy. "Carl told me you had a girl who loved you once," he began, his voice carrying across the space between them. "Amy. And from what he said, you loved her right back. That's a special thing, that kind of bond. Most folks never get to experience it, and you did." Clover's ears were forward, listening with that intense attention Hank had learned to recognize. "I know you lost her. No, it wasn't your fault, but probably feels like it was anyway. Grief's funny that way, makes you feel responsible for things beyond your control." He paused, thinking about his own losses. "When Martha died, I spent months wondering what I could have done different. If I'd noticed her symptoms earlier, pushed harder for more tests, been more insistent with the doctors. Didn't matter that the cancer was aggressive, that nothing would have changed the outcome. I still felt like I'd failed her somehow." The morning sun climbed higher, warming the air, and Hank continued talking. About loss and guilt, and the way love leaves, scars that never quite heal but eventually become bearable. About how honoring what you've lost means continuing to live rather than shutting down entirely. About finding new connections while still holding space for the old ones. By Tuesday, Clover was approaching within 8 feet, while Hank sat in the corral. Not close enough to touch, but close enough for conversation to feel natural rather than forced. Hank brought Martha's harmonica and played the simple melodies that had once filled his evenings. Clover stood nearby, head lowered, eyes half closed, listening to the music with something that looked like peace. Sarah visited that afternoon, bringing news from town. The community had been following Hank's progress with increasing interest. The story spreading from the feed store to the diner to every ranch and homestead in the valley. People who'd written off the donkey as hopeless were reconsidering their judgments. Jake Morrison had started using Hank's methods with difficult horses, reporting unprecedented success. Even Tom Whitfield had admitted publicly at the feed store that maybe the old ways weren't always the best ways. "You're becoming something of a local legend," Sarah said with a smile. "The man who taught patience to a valley that forgot how." "I didn't teach anybody anything," Hank protested. "Just did what felt right. Sometimes that's the best teaching there is, showing instead of telling." Wednesday brought Ellen into the corral with Hank for the first time. He'd prepared Clover the day before, talking about how Ellen was safe, how she'd given the donkey a home when nobody else would, how she'd chosen life over the easier option of death. When Ellen entered, moving with the slow Ellen deliberation Hank had coached her on, Clover tensed, but didn't flee. "Hey there," Ellen said softly, standing still beside Hank. "I know I haven't been much help to you, didn't understand what you needed. But Hank here, he's taught both of us some things about patience and second chances." Clover watched her with wary eyes, but after 10 minutes lay down the posture of relaxation it only showed when feeling relatively safe. Ellen's eyes filled with tears at the implicit trust the gesture represented. "Thank you," she whispered to Hank, "for not giving up, for seeing what nobody else could see." Thursday brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. Reynolds drove out unannounced, explaining he'd come to do a follow-up assessment before the month's deadline. He watched from outside the corral as Hank went through the routine, entering with water and food, sitting in the center while Clover approached and ate nearby, playing harmonica while the donkey listened with clear contentment. The vet's professional assessment was swift and decisive. "That's a completely different animal from the one I recommended euthanizing. The behavioral markers are night and day. Physical health is excellent. Psychological stress indicators are minimal, and the social engagement behavior is well within normal range for a donkey with a traumatic history." "So, you'll support extending his time here?" Ellen asked. "I'll support making it permanent," Dr. Reynolds replied. "This isn't a dangerous animal anymore, it's a healing one. And with continued patient handling, I see no reason it can't live out its natural life here safely." After the vet left, Hank sat alone with Clover in the corral, both of them comfortable in the shared silence. He thought about how far they'd both come in 5 weeks, how Clover had progressed from aggressive panic to tentative trust, how he'd emerged from his grief stupor into something resembling purpose and connection. "We're not so different, you and me," Hank said to the donkey. "Both of us lost someone who made the world make sense. Both of us had to figure out how to keep going when it felt easier to just give up." He smiled slightly. "Difference is, I had 5 years to work through it on my own. You got me pushing you along faster. Not sure which of us got the better deal." Clover moved closer, close enough that Hank could see his own reflection in the dark, expressive eyes. Close enough to touch, though he still held back, waiting for the final signal that touch would be welcome rather than threatening. Friday morning arrived with a sense of anticipation. Hank woke earlier than usual, the feeling that something significant was approaching, making sleep impossible. He went through his morning routine with particular care, checked on his cattle, fed Chester, made his coffee extra strong. The silver buckle from 1972 sat on his dresser where he'd placed it a month ago, and he picked it up, turned it over in his hands. That buckle represented a moment of triumph, of mastering something wild through understanding rather than force. He'd won it on Tornado, the horse everyone said couldn't be ridden. But winning the buckle wasn't the real victory. The real victory was learning that fear drove most wild behavior, and addressing the fear was more effective than fighting the wildness. He tucked the buckle into his shirt pocket, a talisman against doubt. At Ellen's ranch, Hank found her waiting on the porch, her expression a mixture of hope and nervousness. "Today feels different," she said, "like something's about to shift." "Maybe," Hank agreed. "Or maybe it's just another day of showing up and being patient. Either way, we do the work." But as he approached the corral, he felt it too, a change in the air, a sense of culmination. Clover was standing at the fence, not in the defensive posture of the early days, but in an alert, expectant stance, watching, waiting. Hank entered the corral slowly, Chester at his side as always. He walked to the center and sat down, crossing his legs, making himself small and non-threatening. Clover watched every movement, ears forward, breathing steady. "I think today might be the day," Hank said quietly. "The day we find out if all this patience was worth it. If trust can really be rebuilt once it's been shattered so completely." He extended his hand, palm down, arm relaxed. The invitation was clear: come closer if you choose. No force, no demand, just an offer. Clover stood motionless for a long moment. Then, with a decision that was almost visible in its deliberateness, the donkey took a step forward, another. It moved with agonizing slowness, each step a battle between the desire for connection and the learned knowledge that connection led to pain. 6 feet became 5, 5 became 4, 4 became 3. At 3 feet, Clover stopped. They regarded each other across that small distance, and Hank could see the war being waged behind those expressive eyes. Every instinct told the donkey to flee, that humans couldn't be trusted, that proximity meant suffering. But something else, some deep memory of Amy's gentle hands, or the cumulative effect of 5 weeks of patient presence, urged it forward. "You decide," Hank whispered. "Whatever you choose is the right choice. I'll be here either way." Clover's nostrils flared, drinking in Hank's scent. Its ears flicked back and forth, processing every sound, every movement. The moment stretched, suspended in the morning light, everything balanced on the edge of possibility. Hank thought about Martha, about how she'd believed in his gift for healing broken things. Thought about Carl Winters driving through the night with a stolen donkey, desperate to save a life. Thought about Amy, a 12-year-old girl who'd loved this creature unconditionally before illness took her away. Thought about Ellen, who'd chosen to give second chances when easier options existed. Thought about Sarah and Jake and Tom and Dr. Reynolds and all the people who'd watched this slow miracle unfold and been changed by it. Thought about himself and how a damaged animal had called him back from the edge of his own slow disappearance into grief. All of it all, the pain and patience and incremental progress and setbacks and tiny victories, came down to this moment, to whether trust, once broken, could truly be rebuilt, to whether love, once lost, could be found again in different forms. Clover took another step forward. 2 feet now separated them. Hank held his breath, held his position, held space for whatever would come next, and waited for the donkey to decide whether hope was worth the risk of heartbreak. The world narrowed to the space between them. 2 feet of morning air, dust motes floating in slanted sunlight, the sound of Clover's breathing steady and measured. Hank's hand remained extended, palm down, fingers relaxed. An invitation without demand, an offer without expectation. Clover's neck stretched forward, nostrils flaring as the donkey tested the air between them. Hank could see the fine whiskers around the muzzle trembling, could count the individual scars on the legs, could read the entire history of trauma and loss written in the animal's posture. Every muscle was coiled with the possibility of flight, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. But Clover didn't bolt. The donkey took one more careful step, closing the distance to 18 inches. Close enough that Hank could feel the warm breath against his palm, close enough that if he moved even slightly, the animal would startle. So, he didn't move. barely breathed, just held space for this creature to make its choice in its own time. "That's it," Hank murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're doing fine. Take all the time you need." Clover's eyes locked with his, and Hank saw intelligence there, awareness, the profound weight of a decision being made. This wasn't just about accepting physical touch. It was about choosing to trust despite every learned reason not to. It was about deciding that vulnerability might be worth the risk, that connection might be possible without pain following. The donkey's muzzle moved forward another inch, then stopped. Hank could see the conflict written across its face, want and fear in equal measure, warring for dominance. His arm was beginning to ache from holding position, but he didn't lower it, didn't shift. This was Clover's moment, not his. All he could do was hold steady and wait. From somewhere behind him, Hank heard Ellen's sharp intake of breath. She was watching from the porch, witnessing this culmination of 5 weeks of patient work. Chester whined softly, picking up on the tension, but stayed lying down as Hank had trained him. "You're safe," Hank continued in that same soft murmur. "Nobody's going to hurt you. Not anymore. That part of your life is over. You get to decide what comes next." Clover's ears flicked forward fully, the first time Hank had seen them in that position for more than a few seconds. It was the posture of attention, of engagement, of an animal fully present in the moment rather than trapped in traumatic memory. The donkey shifted its weight, leaning slightly forward, and then, with a gentleness that made Hank's throat tighten with emotion, Clover touched its muzzle to his palm. The contact lasted perhaps 2 seconds, a brief brush of warm, velvet-soft skin against Hank's weathered hand before Clover jerked back, startled by its own boldness. But those 2 seconds changed everything. They were the bridge between isolation and connection, between trauma and healing, between the past that had been and the future that might be. Hank didn't move, didn't react, except for the slight smile that crossed his face. "There you go," he said quietly. "That wasn't so bad, was it?" Clover stood 3 feet away now, sides heaving, clearly processing what had just happened. The donkey hadn't been hurt. The touch had been gentle, had asked nothing, had simply been an exchange of presence and warmth. It was, perhaps, the first positive physical contact Clover had experienced since Amy's death 2.5 years ago. They stayed like that for several minutes, Hank still sitting with his hand extended, Clover standing within reach but not quite ready to close the distance again. It didn't matter. The barrier had been crossed once, which meant it could be crossed again. The impossible had become possible, and possibility was all healing ever required. Ellen walked slowly from the porch to the corral fence, moving with the careful deliberation she'd learned from watching Hank. "Did I see what I think I saw?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "You did," Hank confirmed, still not looking away from Clover. "First physical contact, initiated by him, on his terms. That's exactly how it needed to happen. What do we do now? Now we respect what just happened, let him process it without pushing for more. He's given us a gift by choosing to trust, even for just those few seconds. We honor that gift by not demanding he repeat it before he's ready." Hank slowly lowered his arm, the ache in his muscles finally registering. He stood with careful movements, giving Clover time to adjust to each change in his posture. The donkey watched, but didn't retreat further. Another small victory in a morning full of them. As Hank exited the corral, Chester falling into step beside him, he felt the weight of accomplishment settle over him like a warm blanket. They weren't done. Healing was never truly finished, just transferred from active crisis to ongoing maintenance, but they'd crossed a threshold. Clover had chosen connection over isolation, trust over fear, possibility over the safety of emotional shutdown. It was more than Hank had dared hope for when he'd first sat down on that camp stool 5 weeks ago. And it was exactly what both of them had needed, proof that broken things could be made whole again, that love could exist after loss, that patience could achieve what force never could. Ellen hugged him fiercely when he cleared the gate. "Thank you," she said into his shoulder. "Thank you for not giving up." "Never considered it," Hank replied, and realized it was true. Somewhere along the way, this had stopped being about saving a donkey and started being about saving himself. They'd healed each other, him and Clover, through the simple act of showing up every day and trying again. Hank returned to the corral that afternoon, unable to stay away despite knowing the wise thing would be to give Clover space to process. But something pulled him back. An instinct that whispered this day wasn't finished yet, that one more chapter remained to be written before the sun set on this particular milestone. Ellen was in the barn, giving them privacy. Chester had stayed at the house, sensing perhaps that this moment belonged to Hank and Clover alone. Hank sat on his camp stool outside the fence first, the familiar position, and watched the donkey move around the enclosure. Clover seemed different. Less agitated, moving with a fluidity that hadn't been present before. The morning's breakthrough had shifted something fundamental in the animal's understanding of what was possible. Fear no longer controlled every movement, every decision. There was space now for curiosity, for tentative hope. After an hour of simply sitting and being present, Hank stood and entered the corral. Clover's head came up immediately, alert but not panicked. They regarded each other across 20 feet of packed earth, and Hank could feel the question hanging between them. Would they try again? "Your choice," Hank said, settling cross-legged in the center of the space. "Always your choice." He pulled Martha's photograph from his shirt pocket, the one he'd shown Clover during week 4. Studied the image of himself and his wife at that long-ago rodeo, both of them young and unaware of what life would bring. The joy and the grief, the building and the losing, the finding and the letting go. "I think Martha would have liked you," Hank said to Clover. "She had a soft spot for wounded things. Used to rescue baby birds that fell from nests, nurse stray cats back to health, take in dogs nobody wanted. I'd come home and find some new creature she'd decided needed saving." He smiled at the memory. "She saved me too, in her way. I was pretty broken when we met, all wrapped up in proving myself through those rodeo rides. She saw past all that to the scared kid underneath." Clover took a step closer, drawn by the familiar sound of Hank's voice, the calm energy he projected. "The thing about being saved," Hank continued, "is that you have to let it happen, have to choose to accept the help being offered. I fought Martha's kindness for a long time, convinced I didn't deserve it. Took me years to understand that accepting love isn't a sign of weakness, it's the bravest thing a person can do." The donkey moved closer still, now just 10 feet away. Hank tucked the photograph back into his pocket and extended his hand again, palm down, repeating the invitation from the morning. "I know it's scary," he said softly. "Know it feels easier to stay protected, to not risk being hurt again. But Clover—" The donkey's ears pricked sharply at its name, recognition clear in its eyes. "Clover, a life lived behind walls isn't really living, it's just slower dying. I spent 5 years doing that after Martha passed, and it took you to show me the difference." Clover took another step, then another. The distance closed, 10 feet to 8, 8 to 6, 6 to 4. Each step was deliberate, chosen, an act of courage that most humans would never recognize as such. At 3 feet, the donkey stopped. The same distance as morning, but something was different now. The fear was still, present, but no longer dominant. In its place was something that looked remarkably like determination. "That's right," Hank breathed. "You can do this." Clover stretched its neck forward, nostrils flaring, drinking in Hank's scent. The muzzle moved closer to his extended palm, hesitated, then closed the final distance. But this time, instead of jerking back immediately, Clover held the contact. Held it for 3 seconds, 4, 5. And then, in a moment that seemed to stop time entirely, Clover lowered its head and rested its forehead against Hank's palm. The gesture was unmistakable in its meaning. This was trust, complete and offered freely. This was acceptance, vulnerability, the conscious choice to believe that safety was possible. This was everything 5 weeks of patient work had been building toward, not just tolerance of human presence, but active seeking of connection. Hank felt tears slide down his weathered face, not bothering to hide them. His other hand slowly rose and rested gently on Clover's neck, feeling the warmth of living muscle beneath the coarse hair. The donkey trembled slightly but didn't pull away, accepting the touch as the gift it was meant to be. "There you are," Hank whispered. "There's the animal Amy loved. Been waiting for you to come back to yourself." They stayed like that for several minutes, man and donkey, both of them scarred by life, both of them learning that healing was possible if you were patient enough and brave enough to try. The afternoon sun painted everything in gold, and somewhere in the distance a hawk called as it circled overhead. When Clover finally stepped back, it was without panic, without fear, just a natural ending to a moment that had said everything it needed to say. The donkey walked to the water bucket, drank deeply, then turned back to look at Hank with eyes that were no longer wild. Hank stood slowly, his knee protesting as always, and exited the corral. Ellen was standing at the fence, tears streaming freely down her face, having witnessed the entire encounter. "He's going to be okay," she said, wonder in her voice. "He's going to be more than okay," Hank replied. "He's going to thrive. Just needed someone to believe in him long enough for him to believe in himself." As Hank drove home that evening, Chester beside him and the setting sun painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold, he felt a peace he hadn't experienced since before Martha's death. The weight he'd been carrying of grief, of purposelessness, of slow erosion into insignificance had lifted somewhere along the way. He'd set out to save a donkey and ended up saving himself. That was how healing worked, he supposed. You couldn't offer it without receiving it in return. 3 months later, autumn had settled over Montana, with its particular brand of beauty aspens turning gold on the hillsides, mornings sharp with frost, the light taking on that crystalline quality that made everything seem more vivid and temporary at once. Hank still made the drive to Ellen's ranch 3 times a week, though the work had changed considerably from those early days of patient vigil. Now, when he arrived, Clover walked to the fence to greet him, ears forward, making the soft huffing sound that donkeys use for hello. Hank would enter the corral, and the animal would follow him around like a shadow, accepting scratches behind the ears, resting its head against his shoulder while he talked about whatever came to mind. The transformation was complete enough that Ellen had started using Clover for light pack work, carrying supplies to the back pasture, and the donkey performed the tasks with calm reliability. But more importantly, Clover had remembered how to rest, how to lie in the sun without constant vigilance, how to approach new people slowly and carefully, but without panic, how to exist in the world as something other than a bundle of fear and defensive aggression. Dr. Reynolds had made several follow-up visits, documenting the change with professional satisfaction. At the most recent appointment, he'd told Ellen that Clover was one of the most remarkable rehabilitation cases he'd seen in 30 years of veterinary practice. "You'd never know this was the same animal I recommended euthanizing," he'd said, shaking his head in wonder. "Never know it had been hours away from being put down." The story had spread beyond Ridgeline, picked up by a regional newspaper that ran a feature about patients and animal rehabilitation. Hank had reluctantly agreed to be interviewed, though he'd deflected most of the credit to Clover's own resilience. "I just showed up," he'd told the reporter. The donkey did the hard work of choosing to trust again. The article brought unexpected visitors to Ellen's ranch people with their own difficult animals, hoping Hank might work the same magic. He'd turned down most of them gently, explaining that what he'd done with Clover wasn't magic and couldn't be rushed or replicated on demand. But he'd agreed to mentor Jake Morrison, who'd shown genuine aptitude for the patient approach, and together they'd helped 3 other traumatized animals in the valley find their way back to steadiness. On this particular October morning, Hank arrived to find a surprise waiting. A sedan he didn't recognize was parked in Ellen's drive, and standing by the corral fence was Carl Winters, the man who'd stolen Clover from certain death 2.5 years ago. Carl turned at the sound of Hank's truck, his expression nervous. "Hank, I hope it's all right I came by. I've been thinking about the donkey. About Clover, wondering how things turned out. "See for yourself," Hank said, gesturing to the corral. Clover was standing in the center of the enclosure, alert but calm, watching the stranger with curiosity rather than fear. Carl's eyes widened at the change, at the healthy coat and relaxed posture and clear absence of the panic that had defined the animal when he'd last seen it. "That's not the same creature," Carl breathed. "That's not how did you—" "Time," Hank said simply. "Consistency, respect for what he'd been through, and mostly just believing he could heal, even when it seemed impossible." Carl watched as Hank entered the corral, and Clover immediately walked over, accepting scratches and leaning into the touch with obvious contentment. "I spent 2 years feeling guilty," Carl said quietly. "Wondering if I'd done the right thing by taking him, if maybe I'd just prolonged suffering instead of preventing it." "You saved his life," Hank replied firmly. "What came after the fear, the aggression, the trauma that wasn't your doing? You did what you could with what you had. That's all any of us can do." "Amy would have been happy to see this," Carl said, his voice thick. "To know—" He found peace again. Before Carl left, he asked permission to approach Clover. Hank called the donkey. With over, kept a hand on the animal's neck for reassurance, and Carl slowly extended his palm. Clover sniffed carefully, then accepted the touch, allowing Carl to scratch behind its ears the way Amy must have done years ago. "Thank you," Carl said to both Hank and the donkey, "for giving this story a better ending than I could have hoped for." After Carl drove away, Hank sat on his camp stool. He still brought it every visit, creature of habit that he was, and Clover stood nearby, close enough that Hank could rest his hand on the animal's shoulder. They watched the mountains together, the morning light painting them in shades of gold and purple. "You know what the funny thing is?" Hank said to Clover. "I came out here thinking I was going to save you. Thought this was about teaching a frightened animal to trust again. Took me most of a month to realize you were saving me right back." Clover's ear flicked in his direction, listening. 5 years I spent in that fog after Martha died, going through the motions but not really living, you know. And then here you were, more broken than I'd ever been, but still willing to try again. Still choosing to risk connection, despite everything that had taught you connection meant pain. He paused, scratching the spot behind Clover's ear that made the donkey lean into his hand. "You reminded me that healing isn't about forgetting what hurt us. It's about learning to trust again, despite the hurt. About deciding that life is still worth living, even when we've lost what made it easiest." Ellen came out from the house, bringing coffee as she often did now, and joined them at the fence. "Still talking his ear off?" she asked with affection. "He's a good listener," Hank replied. They stood together in companionable silence, watching the donkey graze peacefully in the morning light. In the distance, Chester barked once from Hank's truck, impatient to start the day's routine. Life continued its forward motion, carrying all of them, human and animal alike, toward whatever came next. But for this moment, there was just the 3 of them, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that impossible things sometimes became possible if you were patient enough to wait, brave enough to try, and wise enough to understand that healing worked both directions. Sometimes the hardest things to heal aren't broken bones, they're broken spirits that everyone else has given up on. But given time, given patience, given someone who believes restoration is possible, even the most damaged souls can find their way back to wholeness. Hank had learned that with Clover, and in learning it, had healed himself. That was the gift of broken things. Choosing to trust again, they reminded you that you could do the same. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the valley, and in a corral in Montana, a man and a donkey stood together, both of them scarred by life, both of them proof that love and patience could accomplish what force and fear never could. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything.